Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM's POTUS.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM for Thursday, December 5th. I'm Andrew Wallenworth, and I'm joined by RCP President and co-founder Tom Bevan and Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon. So several outlets are now reporting that President Biden and some of his senior aides are discussing preemptive pardons for government officials who they believe might be targeted by the new Trump administration. So on the list are people like retired General Mark Milley, former GOP Representative Liz Cheney, Senator-elect Adam Schiff, and Dr. Anthony Fauci. So this is quite a development. Tom, what do you make of it? And do you think these preemptive pardons are for real?
I don't know if they're for real. And one clarification, Andy, I think you said the reporting that I saw from Jonathan Martin and Politico is that Biden was not involved in these discussions. This is happening with Jeff Zients and some of his inner circle, that he's been left out of these discussions, at least thus far. But is it for real? I don't know. I mean, I've seen people talking about it, Michelle Goldberg on MSNBC and some others saying, Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post, this idea of blanket pardons for people, even though they may or may not have committed crimes, and who knows how far back or forward these pardons are going to go, that this is somehow acceptable now and should be part of our new norms, which is absurd. I mean, this would be a radical break from tradition and precedent, and it's all because of, again, Donald Trump and their fear that he is going to weaponize the Justice Department or whatnot, despite the fact that, you could argue that President Biden and Democrats have been doing just that against Trump for the past 4 years, but suddenly now it's a huge threat, and they need to take these radical measures to try and nip it in the bud. I think it's somewhat outrageous, actually, but it seems to be under discussion.
Yeah, well, Representative Brendan Boyle, Pennsylvania, he is a Democrat. He supports the pardons, Carl, and he says these patriots shouldn't have to live in fear of political retribution for doing what's right. The time for cautious restraint is over. We must act with urgency to push back against these threats and prevent Trump from abusing his power. Compelling argument. What do you think?
Well, there's something to it. Donald Trump has not, since his election, he has not extended an olive branch to Democrats. He's not tried to say he's going to lower the temperature. This lawfare, Tom said it can be argued it was used against Trump. It was self-evident it was used against Trump. And most Republicans, all Republicans, thought it was wrong. Most independents did too. It's one of the reasons Donald Trump was elected president. Mm. And I understand the impulse. He wants to strike back. He wants to even the score, and not even that. Maybe hold to account is the better way to say the people who abused their position, their public trust for partisan purposes. That's the view of the incoming administration, and I understand it. But there's problems with it, Andy. This is not. And it extends the logic of the Supreme Court's decision that the president can't be held criminally liable for decisions he made as an official to everybody in the executive branch. And all of the things the Democrats have said critical of that decision, now they're just forgetting they said any of that. And they're saying, oh, yeah, we kind of like that logic, and we want to extend it to everybody in the executive branch for anything they may have done. So it's an escalation. It would be. And in a sense, the Democrats they're caught because they have criticized this specifically, this exact concept. Now they want it applied to them. It makes them look hypocritical. On the other hand, Donald Trump, he's accused Mark Milley of treason. This is a general, a much decorated general. He said some intemperate things that make these people worried about their futures. I understand.
How real is it, though, Tom? And is it just a sort of stalking horse for a certain number of pardons that might come down the line, including pardons for other members of the Biden family?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I certainly think that there will be more pardons coming, including ones for James Biden, the president's brother. He was involved in a lot of the influence peddling stuff that Hunter Biden was associated with. And so I fully expect that he's going to get something as well, probably something similar, this wide grant of immunity for the last, 10 years or whatever. But I don't know how seriously they are taking this and whether it's legitimate or not. As Carl said, I mean, it would be definitely a new precedent and probably not a good one to just have presidents. I mean, again, up until now, it's a very potent power that the presidents have to be able to do this, and it's been used, I would say, in mostly circumstances where presidents are showing sort of mercy to people who have, served time for offenses or whatnot. It's occasionally been used for not so great purposes, like Mark Rich and some of the other ones. But by and large, I mean, this would sort of change the nature of it, right? To just say, oh, I'm giving, giving all these people who potentially are,
they'd have to be blanket pardons because they've not been accused of any crime.
Well, it changes the whole idea of what a pardon is, you guys. Yeah, that's right. The way the founders, I hate to speak for George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they were very eloquent people, but the idea behind the pardon was that the king, it was the only power that they wanted the president to have that the king had, because they thought mercy was a good trait to encourage in chief executive. The idea the founders would have had was that these people, if they committed crimes against while in office and they were duly charged and convicted, then President Trump would pardon them. That would be a show of mercy. It was not intended to cover up your own criminal activity. It was not intended to encourage or excuse and wipe away abuses in the executive branch of power. I mean, Richard Nixon was pardoned by Jerry Ford. He didn't pardon all these people who worked for him. And you could argue that President Trump started this precedent, not the Democrats. He pardoned Roger Stone. He pardoned these people who worked for him. I understood why he did it. He thought those were all but kangaroo.
That was after they'd been accused and gone through a trial and been convicted.
That's right, and that's right.
And
I understood.
Different.
Yeah, that's right. It's not. Yeah, it's an order of magnitude. It's really upping the ante.
Yeah. Well, I just, Matt Taibbi, who we're all, I think, fans of, he described it this way. He said this Politico piece, going back to what Tom was talking about, by Jonathan Martin, might be the first of the era that needs to be read entirely between the lines. White House officials are carefully weighing preemptive pardons really means White House officials already decided but are publicly floating the idea. Pardons for, quote, those who've committed no crimes means those who've committed crimes. Could suggest impropriety would admit impropriety. And criticism from the right is criticism from all. I think he's got it right. I mean, they would not be talking about this if this was simply, an idea. This is something that they've thought seriously about, with or without the president in the room.
But Andy, it may be a trial balloon that they floated to see if it flies.
Well, yeah, no, I'm sure. But I mean, even the fact that they're floating a trial balloon that's so unprecedented, I think is it's news.
Jen Rubin's for it, so she approves of the balloon. So there you
go. There's one thing about it that no matter what your politics are, I think you is troubling. And everybody know, if they listen to our show, that I'm nonpartisan. But if Dr. Fauci did things that he's never been called to account for, giving somebody a blanket sort of free check for anything they did, that means if he lied to Congress, if there were perjury in these documents, if the law was circumvented to allow United States taxpayers' dollars to go to Wuhan, some of these issues that the Democrats haven't been wanting to explore, this is something, it shuts off even inquiry. Doing it this early in the process, premature. I don't think my own views, none of these people should be charged with crimes. But by saying that you're giving them blanket a pardon for anything they may have done, it takes away the possibility of accountability. Yeah, right. I think.
Yeah. Well, guys, we're going to have to leave it there. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Carl Cannon. We'll be back right after this.
This is Real Clear Politics on POTUS, Sirius XM Channel 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics with Andrew Walworth. You're listening to Sirius XM's POTUS, Channel 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Carl Cannon. And Carl, Mitt Romney gave his farewell address on Wednesday. He's 77. He will be returning to private life in Utah. He was, of course, the Republican nominee for president in 2012. He's not a huge Trump fan. What should we be thinking of Mitt Romney as he heads west?
Well, you say he's not a huge Trump fan. Well, he voted to convict Trump twice in 2 impeachments. And so, MAGA world and most of the Republican Party has turned against him. He probably could have won again in Utah, but maybe not. He was Trump's popular there. But he gave a farewell address this week. He was as gracious as you'd expect. He's just a very gracious person. He said he's learned that after 25 years in public life, politics alone cannot measure up to the challenges we face. And then he left on some grace notes. I'll read you 2 more sentences. A country's character is a reflection not just of its elected officials, but also of its people. I leave Washington to return to be among them and hope to be a voice of unity and virtue. For it is only if the American people merit his benevolence that God will continue to bless America. May he do so, is my prayer. And I'd say one other thing about Romney. He was the nominee for president, ran against Barack Obama. He lost. Obama ran a very negative campaign against him. Romney ran a kind of an aspirational campaign. It wasn't enough. And the record should be clear. Whatever his problems with Donald Trump, he sided with the Trump administration on most important issues. And as a presidential candidate, he was ahead of the curve. He was ahead of his own party on immigration. He had a tougher view of the border enforcement than I thought at the time was warranted. He turned out to be right about that. And he was ridiculed by Romney and all of Tom's friends in the legacy media for saying that Russia was maybe our preeminent, geopolitical foe.
Obama ridiculed him?
Obama ridiculed him. So did most of the press.
Right. Yeah.
But Romney turns out to be a guy who's, decent guy and had a lot to say and saw things around the corner. He can leave Washington with his head held up high.
Tom?
Well, just for the record, when we had our editorial meeting, I got outvoted. I did not want to talk about Mitt Romney. I'm not really sure that Mitt Romney merits a whole segment. Well, look.
25 years in public life, he doesn't get 6 minutes on the radio.
Yeah, I don't know. Look, Romney, I think Romney in many ways sort of epitomizes the sort of before Trump, after Trump effect, right? He was the nominee of the party in 2012. And in 2016, when Donald Trump won the nomination, it became Trump's party, and Romney initially wanted to be part of that, and then sort of became one of the stalwart never Trumpers in the Senate. And as Carl mentioned, sort of voted with him on some things, but also voted to impeach him. And look, Romney has he is a great family guy, and I think
Tom, he actually reminds me of you. He's got 5 kids like you do. He's just a stalwart husband. He's very, very decent person.
He's way more decent than I am, Carl, and Donald Trump. But I think that's one of the things. It was a character thing for him, more than a policy thing. And look, when Romney first came on the scene, though, it was very clear that the way that when he was in Massachusetts and trying to win election there against Ted Kennedy, he was very sort of willing to change his positions on a number of issues. Some would call that pragmatic. Some would call that hypocritical. Very ambitious guy. He had all this success in the private sector, and
he saved the Olympics.
got bored and wanted
Saved
something
the
else to
Winter
do, so went into
Olympics. Remember
politics.
that?
He
Remember
did.
that?
He
No.
did save the Winter Olympics, and that was another sort of feather in his cap. So, look, he's had a distinguished career, but I think he ends. You know, at one point he was the standard bearer of the party, and he leaves Washington now as the small minority of folks who just couldn't get with the Trump program, and that's where the party is now. That's where the party's headed, and he got left behind.
Yeah. I always when I think of Mitt Romney, there's a 2014 documentary by a guy named Greg Whiteley, who I know a little bit about Greg. I mean, I met Greg. And he did this documentary for Netflix. It was called Mitt. I don't know if you guys remember it.
I remember it.
But
he was ironing his shirt in the hotel room.
Yes, right. There's a shot of him ironing. He's actually ironing his cuff while he's wearing the shirt.
In Iowa somewhere.
Yeah. And it sort of humanized him. And there are a lot of people who thought that if that film had come out before he had actually, people had actually voted, he might have done a little bit better in the general election. Anyway,
and one more thing, look, let's be fair. Romney was treated horribly by the press. I mean, he was portrayed as a monster.
Yes.
A guy who, Barack Obama's campaign said he gave people cancer, and the whole thing with the car, the dog on the car.
Dog on the top of the car, yeah.
Media got a big chuckle out of that, and that became one of the things that people came to know most about him or associate with him. And so he didn't get a fair shake by the press when he was the Republican nominee, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the LPGA. On Wednesday, they announced that they were updating their gender eligibility policy for the 2025 season. So, Carl, the organization said that male players who have gone through male puberty cannot compete in the Tour, the Epsom Tour, the Ladies European Tour, any other LPGA competitions. What do you make of this? And do you think other sports will follow suit?
Well, there's something very interesting about it. It seems on its face to be aimed at Haley Davidson, who's on the tour, who's a transgender person, who's bigger physically than almost all the women on the tour. Haley Davidson certainly felt that targeted by it, but it's also aimed at future players, I think. But the interesting thing is that one of the arguments against letting biological males play girls and women's sports is the danger, the physical, the strength, how much stronger men are on average than women. And so we've seen this in volleyball at San Jose State when that thing got very tense and ugly, really, and in the boxing in the Olympics. And there was no evidence those two women were trans, but people were talking about it. But in those sports, there's a physical competition between men and women directly. Golf, there isn't. And so you think, okay, what's the motivation here? Well, the motivation is that being male at birth or having testosterone, you just hit the ball a lot farther. And that is a fact. Now, you and all three of us are golfers. You and I are duffers. Tom's a pretty good golfer. But if you've ever seen women, even collegiate players, don't go even have pro players, they're better. These female players are better than anybody we know. They're just very good. Right. But at the elite level, these women just can't hit the ball 350 yards. And so what the LPGA is talking about is the advantage in competition. And when the argument to me is put on that basis, then you have a factual argument and you can exchange views back and forth. And it actually opens the door to conversation.
Tom, what do you make of it?
It's an interesting sort of reversal on the part of the LPGA, and I think shows that the pendulum sort of is swinging back in the direction of protecting women's spaces and women's sports and fairness. I happen to know the commissioner. She's going to be the former commissioner soon. I think she's leaving in January. Molly Marcoux Salmon. She was the athletic director at Princeton. Before that, she graduated my class. I knew her very well. She was a phenomenal athlete, fantastic hockey player, just all around great athlete, great golfer as well. And so I think she comes from that place where, wanting to protect the opportunities that women have to play athletics, both at the collegiate level and at the professional level. And again, I think it just shows that's where the tide is moving. It's on all of this stuff where the pendulum has swung so far in the other direction, on DEI and all these things. Now all these companies are clawing their way back to the middle, and I think it's a good move by the LPGA, and I think it's a good move for women's sports in general.
What do you think, Andy?
Well, we'll see how much pushback they get on it. I mean, I think, I have 3 daughters, so I'm against biological males competing in women's sports, full stop. I think that it's interesting that the LPGA is sort of first out of the box in doing this, and I think other sports will follow suit. So I think it's a good thing. But you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I've got Tom Bevan with me and Carl Cannon. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back after this.
This is Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. Covering the news fairly and honestly.
You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM's POTUS, Channel 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined now by Susan Crabtree. She is one of our national political reporters and covers very distinguished journalist covering the Secret Service beat, winner of the Dow Prize. Congratulations for that, Susan, by the way.
Thank you so much. Too kind, but
quite an honor. But this beat continues to be explosive, shall we say. And so today we had this congressional hearing, right, where they were going to present, the final findings. And there was this very explosive exchange between the acting Secret Service Director, Ronald Rowe, and Republican Representative Pat Fallon of Texas. And I mean, if you're on the internet, you saw it. It was never, I shouldn't say never, but it's rare that you see two folks yelling at each other at the top of their lungs. And so I guess the question was, Susan, and maybe you can fill our listeners in on exactly what because the clip, if you've seen the clip, it doesn't really give you the full context, which is the question was to Ronald Rowe was, were you the acting agent in charge on that day, which was 9/11, the ceremony at 9/11, Ground Zero on 9/11, and that kind of set him off, and then there was this back and forth exchange. What was this all about?
So the reason why he's sensitive about it, because he knows where the congressman was going. I had heard about this a few months ago. There was so much going on. It was a deluge at the time of news, so I didn't report it. And honestly, I think what happened was these 9/11 ceremonies are very deeply personal for the Secret Service because some of them were directly involved in going into the World Trade Center and carrying bodies out, survivors. And
Ronald Rowe said he was one of those people.
He was not one of those people. So
okay.
He was involved afterwards, and it was a kind of a gruesome job that he had, and our nation owes him a debt of gratitude. But he wasn't there on 9/11. This is about a photo op and removing people so that he could be more prominent in the photo op right behind President Biden during the 9/11 ceremony, because as Pat Fallon accused him of, he was auditioning for the job, for the full job. He's been auditioning for the full job on whoever was elected president to name the director. So I had heard about this because agents were very upset that he broke operational protocol, which is to have the people that are in charge, the top person on a president's detail or the vice president's detail, to be nearest to them in one of these ceremonies. And they're operational. They have an earpiece and they have a gun, and they're listening to any threats that come down so that they can be prepared to react to them. And basically, Pat Fallon said, you moved these people to the side. You jeopardized the president's security and the vice president's security for your own photo op. And,
from what you know about, is that a fair accusation to make? Is that actually what happened? Were the president and the vice president, were their lives put more at risk by what happened?
I believe so, from what my sources are telling me. Now, nothing happened that day. That's what the Secret Service job is, mainly to precautionary and to stand watch and to be always on guard. But you have to be operational. And Ron Rowe did say during that exchange, as he was they were screaming over each other, that he did have his gun and his radio that day. Pat Fallon asked him that question. And my sources are saying that's really dubious, whether that is true or not. I've asked the Secret Service. I actually got a response to my first questions from the Secret Service already, and which is really rare for them to get back to me so quickly. They usually take a full day, but they know that this is deeply concerning and was a terrible look today at the hearing.
All right. Well, sounds like we're going to have a story from Susan Crabtree coming up soon with some more details on that particular exchange. But Susan, what about the rest of the hearing? Did we learn anything new? What's the sort of culmination of these investigations that have been done surrounding both assassination attempts on Donald Trump?
So I didn't expect this. I expected this to be kind of a, boring hearing, because there's been so many different independent review board had its own findings in its report. You had the only report that I think might be interesting is the Office of Inspector General report that's still pending. We had the Secret Service's own report. We had a Senate report that was very actually penetrating, that report. But then the House Task Force has some kind of followed up on all of these things. So it's sort of expected regurgitation of what we already knew, which was the AGR building was not manned. They didn't have communication. They had siloed communications. We didn't improve that since 9/11, and that needs to be taken care of. We didn't have a drone up in the air. So we knew all these things, but I felt like Mike Kelly, who's the chairman of the House Task Force, was being a little too deferential to Ron Rowe. And they were thanking them for its cooperation and that he's put in place some reforms. From what I'm hearing from the rank and file on a daily basis, they are not happy with Ron Rowe, and they blame him that he was the number two and was part of these decisions to deny security repeatedly over 2 years to Donald Trump. So no one called him on that until Pat Fallon came up, and the exchange before this one that probably irritated him because he was blaming, Pat Fallon was asking him, did you know about the Iranian threat against Trump's life? And why, if you knew, why wasn't there a counter surveillance unit in there? And why wasn't there a full counter assault team, which is they're the most prestigious and more like special forces operators that protect the president. And he was already getting agitated at that point. So when the photo op question came up, he was on edge.
So let's talk about, we've got just a couple of minutes left, Susan, and let's talk about what happens here. Donald Trump has yet to name the director of the Secret Service, and I guess you can list the names better than I can. Dan Bongino is one of them. I don't know who else is in consideration, but so tell us who's sort of got the inside track for this job, and who's advising Trump on this? Like, where's he getting, who's in his ear talking to him about, candidates for Secret Service?
Well, Dan Bongino took his name out of the running about a week and a half ago after that UFC fight that he attended with a lot of, obviously there was a lot of Trump world there that night. But Sean Curran, the other contender for the job, who's the head of Trump's detail, was there protecting Donald Trump. And he was actually in some of the photos from that Madison Square Garden night. So he's still a top contender, although there's concern even from Eric Prince, who does have Don Jr.'s ear and does have the president's ear and has testified on the same panel, in a subsequent panel that I testified at at the Heritage Foundation in August. So he has been really critical, Eric Prince, and he's in charge of and owns the Blackwater. He's a former Navy SEAL security team that got into some controversy in Iraq about killing civilians, but they never lost a protectee. So he has some strong opinions about not getting Donald Trump off the stage very quickly. So I think he's a dark horse for the candidate. Whether he'd want to do that and leave the private sector is another question. There's other people in the Secret Service, former Secret Service members, Tom Armas, who was a 9/11 hero and did run into the building when people were running out in the World Trade Center. He is now a Marine general. He's a contender, Micah D'Ambrosio, who's still on this Secret Service. He's a senior member. And he actually carried Donald Trump out when he was facing a threat very quickly and did a very good job a couple of years ago in Nevada at a campaign rally. There are several others, but those are the people that I'm hearing the most.
And when do we expect a decision on this?
I would expect, it's not something that requires Senate confirmation, although Senator Grassley would like to change that. But so I think it's a deeply personal decision. And I think he's going to take some time because he knows that President Bongino and Sean Curran really do want the job, from what I gathered, and it'll be difficult for him when Sean Curran's protecting him to also tell him, yes, you have the job, or you do not. That's very sensitive. So in these weeks leading up to the inauguration, his personal security is first and foremost, obviously, in his mind and his family's minds, and for our continuity of government. So I think we might not hear about this until for some weeks. I could be surprised.
Interesting. Yeah, because he's moved so quickly on so many other fronts with a lot of these appointees. It's this one sort of conspicuously taking a little bit longer. All right, we have to leave it there. Susan Crabtree, national political reporter for Real Clear Politics. Susan, always great to talk to you. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, we are going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM after this.
This is Real Clear Politics on POTUS, SiriusXM Channel 124. Honest reporting and an authentic picture of public disclosure. This is Real Clear Politics on POTUS, SiriusXM 124.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics. Talking now with Tevi Troy, who's a columnist and just an all-around smart guy. He's a senior fellow at the Reagan Institute. And he's also, I want to mention his book. Tevi's the author of The Power and the Money, which was named by The Economist as one of the best books of the year. So The Power and the Money. Tevi, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, you have a recent column in the Wall Street Journal, which I wanted to talk to you about, and then we'll just get talking about presidents in general. You and I both realize when you cover a president, you're covering an institution, you're covering the presidency, not just the person who's in office. But just tell our listeners and viewers just a little bit about your column in the Wall Street Journal, and then we'll be off and running.
Sure. And I'm so glad you said that about the presidency, because that's how I see what I do. I'm covering the presidency. And in my books, I cover the presidency and big topics like CEOs or infighting or disasters. And it's an important American institution. And I think we should respect it, revere it, treasure it, but also protect it and make sure it's there for us to save us from maybe fascism on the right or socialism on the left. It's an important bulwark against excess in American life. And my piece in the Wall Street Journal this week is about what happens when a president is leaving office. He still has the authority, he still has the title, but does he really have the go-ahead from the American people to start bold new initiatives, to do things that maybe they signaled their displeasure about in November? And these days we have a relatively shorter transition period. In the old days, it used to be from November till March. So it's almost half a year when Herbert Hoover was still president, kind of drifting and trying to figure out what to do about the Great Depression before Franklin Roosevelt came in. Now it's a much shorter period from November to January, but still there's a lot that a president can do in that period, and that's what I wanted to get into.
Well, you mentioned the 1932 election, and so as the calendar turned in 1933, a bank was failing every day in this country, every 6 hours. Roosevelt wouldn't speak to Hoover. American people in their wisdom, with the help from the Congress and the legislatures, changed it to January 20th from, I think it was March 4th. But yep. My question, let's talk about that for a minute. Is that still too long in this day and age? And here's the context. I'm asking that question, Tevi. This week, Joe Biden went to Africa, to Angola. It appears that he may have fallen asleep during a meeting. He was shuffling around. He wasn't he's 82. I have great empathy for the man, and Donald Trump is like negotiating with with President Zelensky. It's like, and you can't have two presidents at one time, and you can't have no presidents at one time. And I guess I'm wondering, should we change it again and make it shorter?
Yeah, it's a really terrific question. It is definitely the case that it was a good move to change it from March to January. Now, would you move it up from January? The reason you need that period from November to January is for the transition, but we now have a presidential pre-election transition act that requires both parties, if they are challengers, to have a paid for by the government transition effort in place before the election. So maybe now with that pre-election transition system that we have in place, maybe it would make sense to have the transition period shorter. And in some ways, I do like the period when a president's going out because it allows the president to leave with dignity. One of my favorite stories, I'm sure you remember this, is when George H.W. Bush was leaving office and he invited Dana Carvey to come to the White House and do his imitation of George H.W. Bush to cheer up the staff around Christmas time. And so
I watched that clip on YouTube recently. It's great. Yeah.
Everybody listening should watch that clip.
If you just watched that clip, you would know Bush had lost the election. He was a happy man and a classy person. I don't know.
Classy, very gracious. Yeah.
Well, okay, but now we don't quite have that, do we?
Alas. No, look, presidents can do a lot of mischief. I don't like what President Obama did on his way out the door when he refused to veto a resolution that was an anti-Israel resolution that a typical president, an American president, would have always vetoed. He was trying to do it as a kind of a kick to Israel on the way out the door. I didn't think that was a classy move at all. So
no, and
mischief.
Well, it's a contrast. Bill Clinton, who, people around him told me, I don't mean this as a negative, that he really wanted to win a Nobel Peace Prize. He coveted that, but he coveted it for the right reasons. He wanted to bring peace in the Middle East. And so when on the way out the door, I'm thinking, so Bill Clinton is leaving office. George W. Bush is coming in. So he replaced one Bush and was replaced by another. And he was doing two things in that transition, Tevi. One is really trying hard to get a peace deal and he got a great deal for the Palestinian people, and it would have brought peace to Israel. And of course, Yasser Arafat rejected it, showing a candid world that Palestinian leadership didn't really want peace. They wanted something else. At the same, and he didn't win the Nobel Prize and he didn't get the peace deal, but he also was pardoning his cronies, including Mark Rich, a person who was a fugitive who had never even answered the justice. And that was, we've forgotten about that now, but you'll remember, Tevi, that was a black mark against Bill Clinton. People didn't think it was what the president should be doing on his way out the door. And now we have a president, again, pardoning his son.
Yeah, well, first of all, obviously, I didn't forget about Mark Rich. I even mentioned him in the journal piece. That's my bread and butter as a presidential historian. But I'm glad you mentioned the thing about Clinton and Arafat, because Clinton really did work very hard in those last days to get a deal. And he did get a good and a fair deal for the Palestinian people. And he had this conversation with Yasser Arafat, who was the terrorist leader of the Palestinian Authority. And he said, as he was leaving, Arafat said to him, "You're a great man. You're such a great man." Arafat would always kiss up to people. And Clinton was mad. He said, "I'm not a great man. I'm a failure. And you made me one because you rejected the deal." And the failure thing, your point, it kind of set off a light bulb in me. I didn't quite realize this. He wasn't saying I'm a failure because I didn't get peace. I'm a failure. I'm not going to get the Nobel Peace Prize because you rejected the deal.
Well, I at the time, and I covered Bill Clinton, I thought that was, petty's the wrong word, but I thought it was that old phrase, keep your eye on the prize. I don't think he should have had his eye on the prize, but in hindsight, the Nobel Prize would have been fitting, and it would have signaled that he did get a deal. So I'm much more charitable to Bill Clinton now in that regard than I was at the time, especially what's happened in Israel. He tried, and the Trump administration tried, and I sometimes despair that we'll ever get peace there. But let me talk about another country now, Ukraine. So Donald Trump, when he first came in, you'll remember this, before he'd even been inaugurated, and late in this time of the year in 2016, the FBI was sort of running a sting operation on Michael Flynn. And, Joe Biden himself was talking in the Oval Office with President Obama about, the Logan Act, which is, private citizens are supposed to negotiate on behalf of the American government. Donald Trump is sort of openly violating the Logan Act and talking about it publicly. It's probably an unconstitutional law and it's never really been enforced. But I question whether the president-elect should be negotiating peace deals. As a presidential historian, Tevi, will argue with me or back me up here.
Well, first I want to talk about the Logan Act, because the only time the Logan Act is ever enforced is by opinion columnists and editorial writers. Nobody else enforces the Logan Act. So I think it's a good thing to point out, but it's not a serious thing. But you say that the president-elect should negotiate peace deals, and I get it, but should the outgoing president negotiate deals that bind the hands of the incoming president? And that's a good question, too. This is, as you say, it's a very strange period.
But Tevi, this brings us back to where we started. Let me take a small commercial break here. I'm talking to Tevi Troy, who's a senior fellow at the Reagan Institute and author of The Power and the Money, which The Economist says is one of the best books of the year. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington bureau chief for Real Clear Politics. Tevi, we've come full circle. So in 1933, late Christmas time, 1932, and into the new year, FDR wasn't going to be nominated. Wasn't going to be inaugurated until March 4th. And you had this time where the banks were failing, the economy was reeling, people look help. And Roosevelt didn't want to be tainted with Hoover, who was unpopular. He wouldn't speak to him. It was one of the worst transitions. And when you're talking about peace deals being negotiated by an outgoing president, that's not cool. By an incoming president, that's not good either. The obvious solution seems to be, and I don't mean to, diminish the sainted Franklin Roosevelt, but you think they could work together. There's nothing between them now electoral. The election's been held. It's over. It seems to me that you could have an incoming president and an outgoing president, and they would have, sort of twice the credibility. They'd be speaking for the entire American people. Wouldn't that be the best system?
It would. And let's say the way I look at it, there's three scenarios. One is where the incoming team kind of defeats the outgoing team, which is kind of what happened here, even though Biden wasn't on the ballot, Trump defeated the sitting vice president. Another is where the incoming team succeeds the outgoing team. That happened with George H.W. Bush when he left and took over for Reagan. They were working cooperatively, although many maybe Reagan aides, as you recall, thought they would keep their jobs in the Bush administration and didn't get to. And then the third is where you have opposite teams, but they're willing to work together. And I think about George W. Bush, who went out of his way to be helpful and cooperative to the incoming Obama team and instructed his staff, no midnight regulations, cooperate as much as you can. This is going to be the best outgoing transition ever. So there are three scenarios and they play out differently.
Well, George W. Bush looks a little better every year, doesn't he?
He sure does, every minute.
Well, okay.
Clinton, I got to say, I told Mac McLarty this, who was Clinton's first chief of staff. I said, Mac, in every one of my books, Bill Clinton came out better at the end than I thought he was going to be when I started writing them. Well,
yeah. Now, my father and I wrote a book called Reagan's Disciple. My father, Lou Cannon, was the preeminent Reagan historian.
A legend.
Despite what Max Boots thinks, I think he's still the preeminent preeminent Reagan historian. And we wrote a book called Reagan's Disciple. And Reagan came out better in the book than the guy was covering, George W. Bush. But, when people go to vote for presidents, they're judging by the people who came before them. But when presidential scholars evaluate presidents, we also we put into the mix who came after them. And so George W. Bush, he didn't do as good for the Republican Party as Reagan did. He left his job approvals was not very high. It was below 40%. But the way he's behaved as next president, seems to me he's given Jimmy Carter a run for his money as one of the great former presidents.
Well, I would say he's better as an ex-president than Jimmy Carter. I know the cliche on Carter was bad president, great ex-president. I don't think he was such a great ex-president. If you ask the successors, all of them, Democrat and Republican, were frustrated by Carter and his violations of the Logan Act. He's always meddling in foreign policy in ways that are not necessarily helpful to the sitting presidents. And again, both Democratic and Republican presidents have been frustrated by him.
Well, I'll say one good thing about Jimmy Carter, since we're being charitable today, Tevi. He really elevated human rights and made it part of American foreign policy, and it has been ever since. And so I think let's end on that, on an up note.
I'll agree with you on that.
All right. I've been talking to Tevi Troy, senior fellow at the Reagan Institution. I'm at the Reagan Institute. I'm Carl M. Cannon, Washington bureau chief for Real Clear Politics. You've been listening to RCP on Sirius XM, POTUS channel 124. We'll be back tomorrow. Same channel, 124, and same time, 3 p.m. in the West, 6 p.m. here in the East.
The
Politics
of
the
United States.
This is POTUS on Sirius XM channel 124.